Our special guest today is Del Robertson, who has written it. It's just, I can't tell you how much I loved this novel. It's an amazing, epic novel about the 13-day siege, and it's cleverly titled Remember Me, or Remember the Alamo. That's a very famous saying. I'm a liar, and a good one at that, is how Del introduces herself as a writer. She particularly enjoys telling tall tales that include history, fantasy, dark humor, the unusual, and the odd. She takes all of these elements and combines them in one big pot, stirring thoroughly and blending the stories that she writes. She's widely traveled and has seen all sorts of interesting people and places along the way and incorporates these experiences into her storytelling. She currently lives, works, and plays in San Antonio, Texas, which is the backdrop of her latest book. Her other works include Taming the Wolf, My Fair Maiden, Melodorius, and they're all available through Affinity Rainbow Publication site at www.affinityebooks.com.
All right, so without further ado, you're on, Del. Take it away.
So Sarah and her brother, they're on their way to San Antonio. The need for wagon repairs and supplies forced them to stop overnight in the unfortunately named town of Paradise. It's there in the general store that Sarah first meets Bailey. The shopkeeper had tried to cheat Bailey on the cost of goods. Sarah intervened, proving she knew her sums, and forced the merchant to be honest. So that's where we're going to pick up the scene at, is in a general store. Sarah selected a small burlap bag from the folded stacks beside the wooden food barrels. She would prefer stout canvas sacks, double stitched at the seams, but suspected that the proprietor purposely didn't stock those, as they were no doubt more expensive to produce. Also, she thought, burlap leaks. The more grain, flour, and sugar that sifted through a burlap bag, the sooner a customer would have to replenish their supplies. Paradise was by no means a bustling town, but there were still people living there. People that needed supplies that it seemed only Jameson's general store offered. No doubt he counted on their repeat business, whether fairly earned or not. That brought back thoughts of the fur trader he'd been haggling with when she entered the store. Upon first impression, fur trader was the profession she'd assigned. Also thought she was a man, when that couldn't be further from the truth. In truth, she was distinctly unlike any woman Sarah had ever seen. Wouldn't that make for interesting reading back home, she thought. She simply must remember to detail as much as she could about her when she had a chance to scribe in her journal. She could just imagine the gasps of astonishment and the looks on the faces of the women back east when they read the exploits of Silly May. I never thought to ask her name. Sarah looked toward the checkout area. The countertop was bare. She glanced around the shop. Mr. Jameson was folding bolts of wool and fabric, his prior customer nowhere in sight. Sarah was mildly disappointed as she turned back to the myriad of barrels. She picked up a metal scoop and began to dip flour into the sack. Ma'am, a hand reached out, taking the flour scoop from her grasp. Sarah looked up, surprised to find she was gazing into warm caramel-colored eyes. Stay away from the sides of the barrel, ma'am. Scoop from the middle and don't go too deep. Less chance of getting weevils that way. Despite the unappealing topic, her voice fell over Sarah like a misting rain on a hot summer's day. Sarah watched as she scooped flour out into the bag, shaking each shovelful as she went. When the sack was nearly full, she gathered the neck and tied it off with a cord. Corn? Yes, please. Sarah handed her another burlap sack the same size as she'd selected for the flour. I don't believe I've had the pleasure. She paused in sifting corn kernels into the sack. She looked at Sarah, a puzzled expression on her face. Proper introductions were not made, said Sarah. What is your name? It was rude of me not to inquire earlier. Well, I feel obliged to forgive you since you were saving my coin purse at the time, ma'am. Name's Bailey Bowen. Buckshot to some on account of my being fair to middling with a rifle. She hitched her shoulder to indicate the gun she carried. Your accent doesn't sound regional. Where are you from? Bardstown, Kentucky, ma'am. She removed her cap, folding it and tucking it into the waistband of her belt. Well, it's very nice to meet you, Buckshot Bailey Bowen of Bardstown, Kentucky. I'm Sarah Lindley. She extended her hand in greeting, expecting the firm handshake she'd come to experience as a staple in the West. To her surprise, Bailey took her hand within hers and gently turned it, bending her head and pressing her lips to flesh the way a proper gentleman would. Sarah looked about, seeing the merchant staring at them, a disapproving look on his face. Her eyes darted back to the other woman. Bailey slowly straightened up, her fingertips lingering, stroking the inside of Sarah's palm as she withdrew her hand. Sarah felt heat on her cheeks, and she feared she was blushing red enough to match her hair. A pleasure to meet you, Miss Lindley of the New York Lindleys. Are there any Lindleys in New York? I've never heard of any, said Sarah. I don't rightly know. I've never been to New York, made it to Charleston once. Got a friend that said he visited New York, told me all the women were real refined. Thought you might be from around those parts, Bailey shrugged. St. Louis, Missouri, actually. Is it that obvious that I'm not a local? No disrespect, ma'am, but the way you move with your head held high and the way you talk all proper like, there's no doubt you're a real lady, ma'am. And I don't mean like one of those painted up saloon gals they claim they're from the big city either. Sarah frowned. Well, I don't quite know what to say. I believe you meant a compliment in there somewhere. Bailey's eyes widened. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't mean no offense, but you're just about the prettiest thing I've ever seen, even in that gingham. Sarah's eyes left Bailey. She looked down her front at the plain gingham dress that hung from her frame. It must surely be the most unflattering thing she'd ever worn. I might as well be dressed in one of Mr. Jameson's burlap sacks. She tugged another bag from a stack of bags and tossed it to Bailey. Bailey caught it one-handed. Sarah gestured at a wooden food barrel. Bailey shook the bag open. A small cloud of dust filled the air as she dug the scoop deep into the center of the barrel of beans. She began filling the bag at a rapid pace. I'm truly sorry, ma'am. My words sometimes don't come out right. I just meant you're pretty, that's all. That's enough. Sarah held up a hand to indicate she should stop. Bailey had filled the bag to overflowing, the excess beans pouring out of the sack and back into the barrel nearly as fast as she was scooping. She dropped the scoop and cinched the top of the bag. Sugar? Bailey asked, already grabbing a bag and moving to the next barrel. Sarah looked wistfully at the barrel. It was filled almost to the top and looked as pristine as freshly fallen snow. No, thank you. I believe that will be all. Bailey looked at her skeptically, but nevertheless gathered the 3 bags she had filled and carried them to the front counter. As Mr. Jameson weighed the bags, Sarah glanced around the general store. Add a slab of hog fat, please. Sarah pointed to a bar suspended horizontally from the ceiling where strips of uncooked meat were draped. She sniffed in disdain as a horsefly buzzed past and landed on a strip of pork. Mr. Jameson used a barbed hook to spear a piece of meat. Thankfully not the one the fly was on, and bring it down to within reach. He grabbed the hunk of hog and jerked it from the barb. It made a particularly unappetizing squelching sound as he slammed it down on the counter. She waited patiently as he measured out butcher's paper to wrap it in. Fortunately, her purchase was totaled correctly, and there were no difficulties with Mr. Jameson. Sarah figured she could attribute at least part of that to her proving to the merchant earlier that she knew the value of her dollar. She suspected the much larger part was due to the presence of Bailey Bowen standing slightly behind and to the left of her. She couldn't say with certainty, but she had thought more than once she'd spied out of the corner of her eye Bailey fidgeting with her knife. The purchase was made, and Sarah counted the change she had left, not even enough for a sack of coffee beans at Mr. Jameson's prices. She calculated they would have to ration whatever beans they had left, straining them to exhaustion to make them last. Bailey gathered up the provisions. Sarah tucked away her last few precious dollars and looked about, seeing she hadn't been left so much as a small bag to carry, and hurried out. Bailey stood on the longswung porch in front of Jameson's general store, eyes on the horizon. Big fat clouds were gathering in the distance, hanging low in the sky, and she suspected they'd see a downpour before the end of the day. She secured a length of canvas over the supplies she had brought, cinching rope to the sidewalls of the buckboard wagon to keep the material from flapping about if the wind picked up. Mrs. McCallum would be mighty put out if she returned to the ranch with waterlogged goods. A creak of a board behind her caught her ear, and she turned to see Miss Sarah rushing out of the general store. Sarah's step faltered and slowed when she saw her. As she drew near, Bailey reached out, gripping her by the upper arms, fingers closing about the fabric of her sleeves. Her gaze darted over Sarah's face, reading distress in her expression. Are you all right, ma'am? He say you're doing something to you. She looked over Sarah's shoulder towards the entrance to the general store. Pardon? Bailey's right hand clenched into a fist as she shouldered her way past Sarah. Sarah reached out, grabbing her forearm. Bailey, no, he didn't do anything. I turned around and you were gone, and? And Sarah shrugged. And you thought I'd gone off with your flour and hog fat? No, no, no. Bailey moved to one side of the wagon and gestured inside. Looks like Rang and I didn't see you had a buckboard about. I took the liberty of putting your things in the back. Thought you'd appreciate a ride out to your place. Bailey reached inside, thrusting a hand beneath the canvas. She grabbed a burlap bag and dropped it on the ground at Sarah's feet. The impact caused the flour to leave a little dust cloud in the air before settling on the ground, resembling dirty snow. She reached inside the wagon for the next sack. Thought you were different from the other folk around here, too. Guess that's what I get for thinking. Bailey Bowen, don't you dare try to get me with your righteous indignation. You know full well that there's no place for you to have given me a ride, too. I told you I don't live around these parts. Reckoned you were gonna. Reckoned you to be the new schoolmarm. And why exactly would you make that presumption? Because I speak and dress properly? Sarah folded her arms over her bosom and leveled a glare at Bailey. Well, Dad and the last one died of the pox. Figured it's about time they got a new one. Didn't take you to be one of the McCallum's ranch hands, said Bailey. I am not, and I most certainly have not ever been associated with any filthy, stinking ranch hands that bed down with bovines and prostitutes without discrimination. Bailey pushed back her coonskin cap and rifled her fingers through her hair. She turned her head and spat on the ground. You one of them there mail order brides Doc is always talking about? I most certainly am not. If you must know, I am bound for Texas. Paradise is merely an unfortunate stopover on the journey there. Don't tell me you're one of those GT-T'ers. Bailey cocked her head and gave the redhead an appraising look. Pardon me, a GT what? A GT-T'er gone to Texas. It's a slogan for those that picked up, packed up, and moved out. Bailey hooked her thumb at one of the boarded up houses. Oh, I suppose I am. One of those, that is. Bailey scoffed. No, you ain't. You didn't even know what one was till I told you. Sarah's face turned about as red as her hair. Green eyes narrowed, nostrils flared. She sputtered, and Bailey figured she'd curse and spit if she wasn't such a lady. Oh, and what are you, Bailey Bowen? You're certainly no one's bride. Eyes darted to the wagon, and the canvas stretched across the interior. No, I'm not. I've been a lot of things, done a lot of things, been called lots of worse things. But I reckon right now I'm what you might call one of those filthy, stinking ranch hands that sleeps with cows and screws whores. Bailey set the last burlap bag on the low slung porch and laid the slab of hog fat across the top of the 3 bags so it didn't touch the ground. It's all there, but you ought to check to make sure I didn't sneak some beans. You know how us ranch hands are.
You know, I read your on the Affinity newsletter, which I thought was really fascinating, where you said because most of what you write is historical fiction. Your other books are also historical, but you said somebody said they didn't like you because can you share that story, because I thought it was hysterical.
Yeah, so somebody actually came up to me and said she didn't like me or my writing, and I was like, okay, why? And she's like, because you made me learn something. I was like, I'm sorry. And it turned out she thought, most lesfic was light and fluffy, like summer reading material and stuff like that. And she said she didn't like history. She didn't like learning things, but she was reading this book and she was like halfway through and she's like, damn it, I learned something. I was like, okay, what can you say to that, right?
What did you find most rewarding about writing Remember Me?
When I could write the end. No, just kidding. I love history and I love learning new things as well. And, just being able to get into it and telling the story. And part of that is, knowing that us as women, we have a rich history, but for whatever reason, we're never the center of history.
Yeah.
Right.
It's always told from the man's point of view which, that could be they're the ones writing the history. But it was nice to be able to go back in time, pick 2 women and develop their story and show, hey, there's more to their life than hanging out in the kitchen or the medical tent or whatever, or having babies. They had lives. They mattered.
How did you go about making sure that your dialogue was historically accurate? I think in listening to your reading, you really had Bailey down pat.
Oh, shucks. Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
I don't know. I guess part of it is you have to have an ear for, watching movies is great if people speaking the right dialect. And, you know, a lot of times just reading and hearing the voices in your head, which, you know, is real helpful if you got split personalities going on. Wink, wink. No, but you also have to know your stuff. You know what fits and what doesn't. And a lot of that you can read through and you're like, okay, there was not a California Valley girl back in the 1700s or something like that.